Greetings, class. This is Professor Bold, and I'm going to attempt to video again. I have used several different methods to come to you, and so all of them failed so far today, except maybe this one. So I want to give you a brief overview of the chapter. I'm using Screencast-O-Matic, and when I use that, I only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to be talking rather quickly, so no time for complaining about technology. I won't bother you with that. But I hope everybody is doing well in the class so far and that you've had time to meet other people in your group and kind of get acquainted there. I'm still looking through some of the videos that we've had from people, and so everything so far so good. I've asked you to touch base with me this week, so if you will check your announcements and check your emails, that would be great. We're going to look at this chapter 2. This is a quick overview here, but you can read the text in its entirety and get a pretty good feel for things as well. If you're a more detail-oriented person, you definitely want to go through and get the details there in the text, but this will be a quick overview. So this is chapter 2, Historical and Contemporary Influences on Macro Practice. And within the context of this text, we're talking about macro practice as it relates to social work and how social work began. So we're going through the history of social work and how it started and what role macro plays in that. Because if you were listening last week, or if you took the time to listen to my screen on chapter 1, it was very beneficial in understanding micro and macro differences. So we move on here and we're talking specifically about macro. Even though they both come from the same background with the same founders, macro evolved in a different way. So social workers operate in a very complex and rapidly changing society. Now, all you have to do is look around to know that that is definitely true. Social workers definitely operate in a complex and rapidly changing society. And the historical trends that we're talking about today, such as population growth, immigration, industrialization, and urbanization, have definitely influenced how social work macro came to be. I'm going to take these off so there's not a glare there. Okay, a couple of the things that the text talks about, and there is some more detailed information in your textbook, but that the first U.S. Census revealed about less than 4 million people in America or in the United States. And we know nowadays that there is somewhere in the area of 300 million people. So we have definitely grown as a nation. Immigration has always been a key element in population growth in the United States, and immigrants have always had an influence on our social changes in our country. There was a time when the Irish and German immigrants were fleeing famine and political upheaval. There was a time when Chinese migrant workers went west during the gold rush, and I'm sure there are lots of other examples of how immigration has affected our changing society. So it's no mistake that that would be one of the primary areas of concern today on our list in the United States is the issue of immigration. And I know that you all have been hearing a lot about this lately, but for today, we're going to keep it in the context of historical information, and then we can know that there may be some macro solutions to what we're dealing with now in the United States. But prior to this, people had been way back in the 1800s. Our people in this country had been mainly finding their resources in the area of family and local resources, like maybe on a farm. Maybe they had a church to help them out. Maybe they had some close neighbors on the farm. But generally, prior to urbanization and industrialization, people were mainly reliant on themselves and their own families and any resources that they could glean on their own. And then when we had industrialization and we began making the cotton gin, that generated wealth in this nation, which then brought change from the agricultural economies and a population growth. And anytime you have a large group of people coming together, it's going to change how you do things. So I want you to picture, what if we had suddenly 10,000 people move to Arlington, Texas in one day? That would definitely change the way that we do things. It would change the needs of the community, it would change the needs of the people, and it would change the way that we do things. So I want you to keep that in mind, that when groups of people move around, they usually are moving around to where the resources are. And when they do that, changes have to occur in those areas. So some of the changes that we had in the institutional structures were that in the 1800s, organizations such as family and churches and school were very small. But then people began to rely more on resources that were provided by people in cities. So think about it today. If you are not somebody who is farming your own land and sustaining your own life, you may have to rely on the grocery store or someone else to bring you those groceries, or someone else to help you meet your needs for food. So these are some of the things that happened where the jobs were in the cities, and so people would move to the city where they could have a job. Individuals and organizations were not the only thing people needed. They were no longer able to produce exactly what people needed. Population growth leads to more resources, which leads to a need for more resources, which leads to a need for agricultural growth, which leads to a need for processing those resources and industrializing, which then leads to economic growth, which leads to social change. And we also know the other relationship between people and social change is that when people don't have the resources that they need, then social change becomes much more necessary, and this is when social work comes in. So let's go way back. Most of the areas of helping others come from a history in America or the United States from England or European countries, but primarily England. So one of the first institutions or one of the first laws that came about in England due to the number of poor people that they had there was the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601. And this was a time when they were saying they saw too many poor people on the streets, and what are we going to do about those people? And some of the more well-to-do people would say, well, look at them, we can't have them on our streets, we've got to do something about this problem. So what they decided to do was pass the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601 and actually use taxpayer money to support the poor, to provide things that prior to that time the church had been providing. So they also began having places for the poor to stay. So places for dependent children, places for the mentally ill, and places for people with mental retardation. These were facilities where we could sort of put those people out of our sight, I guess. And at the time, it was seen as a good thing that we used taxpayer money, and that was the good thing that came out of it, was that the government would find a sense of responsibility in helping others. Although it did lead to, permanently housing people in not good conditions and things like that. But some of these early ideological influences that built on themselves over time, and that's something I want you to know. I'll always be saying this, that social work builds over time, and some of these ideas that we have build up. But some of the ideological influences were social Darwinism. This was the idea of survival of the fittest, that you ought to be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you can't, then you don't fit here in our country. The other idea was that with westward expansion, that God had willed North America to the Anglo-Saxon race to build a perfect world. Now let's keep in mind, these are one or two people come up with the idea, and they may have a following for that, or someone may say, oh, that's a great idea, let's do that. But good thing is that we also have social justice movements that came along and began to advocate for the people in need. And that's very important to know, that while there's always the one side of people who agree with one way of doing things, usually there's another side to that story. Then we have progressivism, which says that human rights supersede property rights and society is responsible for promoting the collective good. This comes from the Judeo-Christian values of egalitarianism and social responsibility. So let's read that sentence again. Progressivism says that human rights supersede property rights and society is responsible for promoting the collective good. You might want to stop here and just take that in for a minute and just consider that statement in relationship to not just the past, but what we're going through today. Women had a major influence in the organizations. We also had the beginning of case management, which was with these friendly visitors who were more like society ladies who would go and try to help the poor, and kind of what their premise was, they could role model what the right way to do things was. Now, we know that nowadays in social work, we expect the clients to be able to have some say-so in what happens to them and their rights. But back then, it was friendly visitors. They would come. I'm sure they were very well-meaning, but they also viewed poverty as their fault. And their idea was, if I role model to you, maybe you will be better. If you look at my life. Interesting. But this is where we first saw the micro level interventions and where we see people working case by case. It also is where the settlement houses came from, spearheaded by Jane Addams. There are some great videos this week for you to watch. Please make sure that you watch the videos for this week so you can have a good understanding of the foundation of macro practice. And if you haven't watched last week's lecture, which is really just the screen with me talking, if you haven't listened to that, it would be very good for you to listen to that. Also, the Great Depression and other social movements or social occurrences. The Great Depression was the stock market crash of 1929, and it resulted in the impoverishment of vast segments of the population, which then resulted in the passage of the Social Security Act. So typically when we have a social change, it's because something has happened that caused that change. So either it's a population growth or a need for resources or something that has occurred to make that change happen. We had sweeping reforms and social movements in the 50s. We had the foundation of the Civil Rights Movement, the Alabama bus boycott of 1955, the Voting Rights Act of 1964. The 60s saw an amazing rise in social movements. And here is a video. If you will stop here and watch this Cesar Chavez video, there's a lot of good videos on YouTube about Cesar Chavez and what he did. This video is a brief recollection of his life. So you will want to watch that. Also, there were several other social reforms that came along during this time. One of the main things is that the School of Social Work actually the Council of Social Work Education began to recognize the need for macro social work and community organization. Social work is committed to diverse populations. We're committed to helping people in diverse populations. I have about 1 minute left on the screencast-o-matic, so I want to move forward. Here is a list of the diverse and oppressed populations. But it's important that you understand about macro systems and how they might relate to working with your clients, and how macro roles have changed over time, and that we have a commitment to diverse and oppressed populations. Social workers are primarily concerned with advancing human rights as well as social and economic justice. So think about those words. Think about yourself as a social worker this week, and what does that mean for you and for your community wherever you are. I hope that you have a wonderful week and Keep me posted on how things are going. And thank you for your flexibility